Greetings, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm Washington editor-at-large of The Atlantic, and I was one of Dimitri Simes' first people in the predecessor, the preceding institution to this, the Nixon Center, years ago. I was the director of that and worked with Dimitri, Paul Saunders, and you realize over time how many things change, but then how many things really don't. So it's wonderful to be back with Paul, Dimitri, and the team here, pondering provocative and important subjects, particularly today, thinking about media and the national security, the changing terrain, the drama in this, and we've got an outstanding group of people to sort of provoke our thinking and discussion today. We've got, I'm sort of interested in the sociology of this room because we're all down here, and this room sort of filled out and started up with people down at the very end and came in. So we're going to be interested in how this discussion goes, but I think we'll have a very good one. With me, we of course have someone who's been an old friend and colleague of mine. I'm of course at The Atlantic now, and no one could have read or paid attention to The Atlantic or known it without looking at Robert Kaplan's incredible range and numerous cover stories for The Atlantic. But even more proudly, in another role I had at the New America Foundation, Bob Kaplan was also one of our team. He is now senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. In the moment, he's going to help lay out and sort of set the terrain for us. To my right is another great man, Henry Farrell, who is one of the pioneer bloggers and continues to be not just a pioneer, but someone keeping it going in his blog, The Monkey Cage, that is affiliated with the Washington Post. He's a professor at George Washington University. He's one of the most thoughtful people I know, who cannot talk just about the magic of new media and writing and reporting, but basically has data behind most of the things he argues. He's discussed in this range. And then, of course, Jacob Heilbrunn, who helps lead the national interest, another great friend who has been there and has written a piece that in part helped inspire today called Post-Apocalyptic. Essentially, is the Washington Post become the most reckless editorial page in the world? It reminds me of Keith Olbermann on MSNBC when he had his show. He would always pick someone each week and say, this is the most dangerous or the worst politician in the world. And so a bit of hyperbole, but we'll find out where Jacob is with that. But Jacob, of course, is one of the premier defense and national security intellectuals in the world, in my opinion, and it's great to have all of you here today. So without further ado, let me invite Bob Kaplan to set the terrain. We're all going to speak for about 5, 6, 7 minutes and then open up to everyone.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be here at the Center for the National Interest. And let me start by saying for the last 25 years or more, I've occasionally published op-eds in all of these places, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, elsewhere. So I think of myself as a fairly objective observer, and I understand, a bit how you get into these places and how they've changed over the years, how editors change, so there are slight differences and proclivities over how these editorial pages go. Let me make a few judgments here. First is that in a 1968 book, The Political Order in Changing Societies by Sam Huntington, Huntington said that order comes before freedom, because without order there can be no freedom for anybody. And so it's about establishing order. But when you look at the op-ed pages of more or less of American large circulation print media, sometimes called the legacy media, rather than a discussion of order, you get a discussion of values, of American values and how they should apply to foreign policy. There's value judgments that compete with analysis. I would say that if you consider the large circulation, venerable print media, mass circulation print media in the United States, you're talking about the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, formerly the Los Angeles Times, and they I would define them, interestingly, as more or less Wilsonian in varying degrees, in the sense that they want, rather than John Quincy Adams, who said America should not go out in search of monsters to destroy, these editorial pages, to greater and lesser extents, depending on which paper and which editor is in charge over which 5-year period, tend to be, tend to be involved with the other side of the argument, the Wilsonian side of the argument, which is America has to spread its values of civil society and democracy, and if we don't do it, we're not living up to our own standards. So more of an activist foreign policy, in that sense. There was a brief period when the Iraq War went very, very badly in 06 and 07, when there was what the Princeton history professor Gary Bass called in the book Freedom's Battle a Scowcroftian moment, when even the editorial pages that I've been speaking of became realist in a traditional sense. This lasted about 2 years, I would say, before it started to revert back. And so, that was the only time really where they veered from the, from the Wilsonian proclivity. And, of them all, I would say that the Wall Street Journal editorial page is the most militant Wilsonian, but that doesn't begin to define it, because Wall Street Journal editorials take positions on things like insider trading, regulation, half of it's economic, and it's very traditional conservative for the business community type of arguments, which simply do not fall into a category of realist or Wilsonian so easy. So that's the special magic to that page. And though it's the most militant Wilsonian, I would say it's also the most well-written and the most memorable, in the sense that editorials like what they call randos, their review and outlook section, tend to be deeply researched essays in and of themselves that make a very strong point. I disagree with it much of the time. I also find it a lot of fun to read at the same time, so therefore don't miss it. The New York Times is much more moderate Wilsonian, I would say. The Washington Post in recent years has veered to a more militant Wilsonian, but not as fully articulated, I would say, as the Wall Street Journal. It's interesting, if you want to get more classical realism, you have to leave the American print legacy media and go to the British, or at least the British base, because Financial Times and The Economist, though again, it's hard to categorize, because you can always point to this editorial or this thing, which is different, but generally there's more of an acceptance of traditional realism, I would say, in those publications. New media is less doctrinaire. If you like realism, you can find it on blogs, in many places. You can find it, for instance, at this website, at the National Interest website. There's also clearinghouses, sort of like Real Clear World and foreignpolicy.com, which revel in putting out different points of view. Like one article, we should invade Libya. Second article, we should not invade Libya. And they do this all the time, essentially. So they're agnostic almost, as long as you have a fervent point of view, so to speak, one way or the other, and they do try to balance it. Remember, smaller journals have all the right in the world to have a certain proclivity, be it realist, Wilsonian, far leftist, far rightist, because they have to have a specific purpose and they're catering for a narrow group. Large circulation mass dailies, I would argue, have more of a responsibility to present different points of view all the time. Two final things. The landscape is changing. The ground is moving fast under our feet. 5 years from now, what I've just said would probably be dated and very different. Because remember, 5 years from now, or 7 or 8 years from now, some of these mass circulation dailies may not have print editions. There may not be the print edition of the Washington Post 6 years from now, or some other papers. And even if you're the kind of person who says, "Oh, I don't read the print edition, I just go on my online every morning," don't be fooled. It's the print edition that gives these papers their prestige and heft and influence, because whatever you may do on your computer or iPhone, every morning thousands of influential people in Washington open their front door, reach down, pick up the Washington Post, and read the columnists over their orange juice and cereal. And everyone knows that, and that's what really gives it influence. Once print editions go out over the next decade or so, you're going to see a real radically different landscape, because then there is no prestige to fall back upon. All there is how well written it is, how well argued it is, do we present different fresh points of view, etc. Finally, I would like to say that a number of years ago there was a cover story in The Atlantic by my colleague James Fallows about Rupert Murdoch. And in the middle paragraphs of this like 7,000 word piece, there was some very interesting stuff. He said, you have to understand that objectivity is not the natural default position of the media. Objectivity came around during a certain age of technology, when there was a telegraph. Then there were wire services. If you ran a wire service, you had many, many clients, and you didn't want to alienate any of them. So you tended to take a middle-of-the-road position in your reporting. Europe has a different tradition, Fallows went on. He said, Europe, you sit at a cafe table in the morning, you want the right-wing point of view, you buy one paper. You want the left-wing point of view, you buy another paper. That's why Europeans have like several newspapers on their cafe tables. They get objectivity indirectly through many organs rather than directly, and it may be the direction we're going. And it may be that this proclivity for Wilsonianism, moderate, more militant, or whatever, is part of a shift. To more advocacy, even in the main in the main circulation dailies. That is part of the slow, nuanced shift away from the objectivity of past decades. Thank you,
Bob. Thank you for that wonderful tour de force. Henry.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm here today because of a piece that I wrote for Jacob late last year, where Jacob basically gave me a promise that I would be able to write in something which wasn't the standard foreign policy ease of the usual American policy journal, and also promised me the opportunity to give a good kicking to a few people who I thought deserved that kicking. So I had an awful lot of fun with the piece. But behind the piece, there is actually an argument about the relationship between media and American national security, and the way in which that relationship has changed. So what I think is going on is that we've seen a huge shift post-September 11th, which is really a variety of different actors catching up with the consequences of globalization. And what I mean to say by this, if you look at national security, and here I'm not talking about the bombs and missiles part of national security, I'm talking about domestic or homeland security, I'm talking about intelligence. These parts of security have become much more complicated in a variety of different ways, because we do not have a single US national security system that's relatively sealed off from the rest of the world anymore. Instead, one can look at the ways in which different advanced industrialized democracies, they're much more economically and socially and politically interpenetrated with each other. It's very easy to travel from one country to another. It's very easy to do stuff in one country that has consequences in another, and so on. And so I think the history of the relationship between national security and the media over the post-September 11th period has has been dominated by a group of actors who've begun to figure out the possibilities that are offered by globalization and by the way that these forms of integration have proceeded, but rules have not necessarily developed at the same pace, so that there are a lot of fissures, a lot of gaps, a lot of loopholes that people can take advantage of. And the first group of actors to take advantage of this, of course, were terrorists. If one looks at September 11th, if one looks at the way that the terror attacks were planned, they really took extraordinary advantage of the fact that if you were a German resident, a resident of Europe who spoke good English, you would be able not only to live in Germany, you would be able to transplant to the United States. And if you look at the history of the Hamburg cell, the way that the Hamburg cell was able to be so effective was precisely because they could move from one jurisdiction to another, and precisely because of the gaps in both within the US between different intelligence services and national security services, and also the international gaps between European and US intelligence. So these are the first people, I think, who really figure out that there is a different set of possibilities and opportunities out there. Second group of actors to do this are the security services post-September 11th who are trying to respond to this problem. And they respond in a variety of different ways, and some of these ways actually involve also taking advantage of a variety of different jurisdictional ambiguities. If you look at the surveillance debate, the history of post-September 11th is a history of domestic surveillance and international surveillance not glomming together into one thing. There are important differences, important legal differences, but a variety of ambiguities evolving, which can be exploited in different ways. If one looks at the history of extraordinary rendition, really this is a form of jurisdictional arbitrage. You are exporting people who you cannot torture yourself to jurisdictions which can do the torturing for you, and where you can rely upon close relations with your intelligence service, with your cognate intelligence services there, who will give you the information that you want. You see similar kinds of jurisdictional manipulation, trying to work and weave between the rules, the ways that rules haven't caught up with globalization, in the ways that Guantanamo is used, in the ways that various black sites are used by the intelligence services, some of them in Europe to house various prisoners, and you see a host of forms of cooperation between intelligence services which happen with relatively little oversight and with a lot of, again, you have a lot of stuff happening both with intelligence services and with domestic security services, so that, for example, the Department of Homeland Security, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, more or less from the time that the office was invented, is over in Brussels 4 or 5 times a year, engaged in negotiations, engaged in creating a deep and complex web of relations. Where this has really begun to intersect with media is where a third group of actors has begun to start to take advantage of similar jurisdictional ambiguities thanks to globalization, and this is the new breed of, call them activists, call them journalists, the Glenn Greenwalds of the world, other people like that. There's a lot of attention paid to the ways in which Assange, Greenwald and other people have used the internet. That's a significant part of the story, but perhaps more important is the fact that we now live in a world which, in part thanks to the internet, is a world where there is a kind of a cross-national sphere of journalism, and again this offers a lot of opportunities that can be exploited. So you can be like Greenwald, you can locate yourself in Brazil, but still be a crucially important part of the national discussion in the United States. You can, as many of these people have done, you can go to Germany. Berlin has become what London used to be in the 19th century, a kind of a refugee for dissidents from other from places where these dissidents fear that their activities will be interfered with in various ways. And you can also start to play games transporting information, as for example the Guardian has done from the UK to the US, in order to avoid and evade national security requirements. And you can begin to publish stories in ways that evade the traditional relationships of control and of discussion between national media and national governments. So that, for example, if you have a sensitive story about a topic in country A, such as the US, you can publish the story outside of the US, secure in the knowledge that US newspapers are then going to pick up that story and are going to report that if it is sufficiently newsworthy. So again, you see the artful use of different jurisdictions in order to change the relationship between American security and American media, because neither American security nor American media is national in the traditional sense anymore. There are opportunities that can be exploited by sort of basically working across these different jurisdictions. So this presents a number of interesting questions and problems. Most obviously, I think it says that the traditional relationship between the state and media is gravely weakened. It used to be, and still is to some degree, that when the New York Times had some sensitive security story, it would engage in negotiations and back and forth with the US government about what it could publish and what it could not. That, I think, has been dramatically weakened by the events of the last number of years. Not only are these new media sources not playing by these rules and using jurisdictional changes to avoid these rules, but newspapers like the New York Times do not want to be left behind, do not want to be scooped, and so are much less likely to want to play ball than they were prepared to play a few years ago. It also raises some broader questions, I think, for the relationship between national security and democracy. What we see more or less is that national security relationships have become sufficiently complex, sufficiently internationalized, sufficiently difficult to monitor that there are real questions about the relationship going forward. We see these citizen journalists, in a certain sense, are these activist journalists trying to sort of act against these relationships, but they are, I think, a pretty inadequate safeguard, and also in some ways, despite their best intentions, sometimes a very flawed safeguard. So these are the big problems that I see going forward, and I think we're going to see more of this happening, especially post-Paris, where I think a new set of security relationships are beginning to be built between Europe and the United States.
It's quite a package for us to chew on. We will. Next, Jacob Heilbrunn.
Well, Henry has very cleverly avoided naming all the liberal eminences that he attacked by name, including Michael Kinsley and others in his essay. I will not be as prudent here. My essay, written with James Carden, who's here today and may want to volunteer remarks, focused on Fred Hyatt's conduct of the Washington Post's editorial page. And many people said to me that they thought, as Steve just did, that perhaps the title was somewhat excessive or trolling, as the internet phrase has it, in a attention to grab publicity. I felt that the article was actually vindicated by several pieces that appeared shortly after our issue of the National Interest came out. It was after President Obama announced a rapprochement, a détente, in other words, with Cuba. And the Wall Street Journal, which Bob Kaplan mentioned, wrote an editorial not attacking Obama, but sort of, it was on the one hand, on the other hand, it's good for business, but we do need to not lose sight of the human rights. But there was one newspaper in the heart of the capital of the free world called the Washington Post that ran not just one piece, but as far as I could tell, several editorials, and I think 2 op-eds by Jackson Deal, who's the deputy editor of the editorial page, vociferously denouncing Obama for this decision, saying that this was a sellout, that Cuba might be on the verge of freedom. How could the president possibly think that it was a good idea to treat with the Cuban despots, and that I think Deal even went on in his column to say, you never know when these regimes are going to collapse. It happened in the Philippines eventually. The record of democratization suggests that we gave up too early in Cuba, even if it was decades long, and everyone else said that the embargo didn't work. So for me, that was indicative of the direction of the Post, and I thought it was interesting to shine a flashlight, as it were, onto the history, which we did in this piece. We looked at the history of the editorial page from its first incarnation under an editor named J. Russell Wiggins, who some of the veterans here may or may not remember. This was in the 1960s. He was a Cold War liberal, anti-communist, vehement supporter of the Vietnam War. And what I did, or what we did in our piece, was sort of focus on the evolution of the Post into a somewhat more tepid editorial page under Meg Greenfield. It sort of shed some of its hawkishness. And then I argued that under Fred Hyatt, the editorial page has, in a sense, come full circle. And we ended the piece with a quote from an editorial that appeared saying that, you know, that's absolutely imperative for the United States to act as to stop tyranny from progressing in this country and so forth. And of course, it sounded like it was about the Middle East, but it was in fact about Vietnam. Now, in this piece, we're not trying to argue that it's illegitimate for the Washington Post to take these positions. It's not. It is a extremely strident form, modernized form, I would argue, of liberal anti-communism that developed in the late 1940s, 1950s, and at that time had more of a rationale, but that it has been exhumed. There's been no real reckoning at the Washington Post with its own record in championing the Iraq War. And that essentially what we have is a newspaper that is not monolithic on the op-ed page. I mean, there are contrasting views, but the dominant ethos is somewhere in that nebulous zone between neoliberal Wilsonianism and neoconservatism. And I think that has to be explicitly stated. And I don't think the editorial page or the newspapers is quite open about how far it has gone. So in short, what we did was a form of an extended, I think the essay is about 5,000 words, extended form of media criticism, looking at the Post positions on Iraq, on Iran, on Russia, and showing again and again how the editorial page offers the most bellicose or truculent solution each time. I would argue, and I think James would, that it's a formulaic. You don't have the sense of an editorial page that is grappling with the issues and approaching them in an open-minded spirit. Now, why does any of this matter? Why should we care about an editorial page? I mean, Fred Hyatt might respond that he's delighted that anyone would even pay attention, as we did in our piece, to what they're writing, because a lot of times editorial pages, let's face it, the New York Times is a pretty boring editorial page. The Post does at least take a stand. I would argue that our piece did merit this close look at the Post, because it is still a central clearinghouse, as Bob was saying. Maybe that won't be the fact, maybe that won't be the case in 5 or 6 years, but I do think it is symptomatic of a phenomenon in Washington that we experience today, of a profound reluctance to grapple with what happened during the Iraq War and its aftermath, and what our foreign policy is today. In essence, I think much of it is on autopilot, and that's what our look at the Post tried to analyze.
Thank you very much, Jacob. There's a lot to unpack here. I thought, when Jennifer Rubin was hired at the Washington Post, or just before that, I knew she was going on board there. Some of you may know Jennifer. She writes what is supposed to be a conservative column for the Washington Post, and I, at the time, had written to Fred and said, she's really not a conservative in that sense, and it's going to very much be focused on Israel. And have you read these various columns that she's written elsewhere? Because there's sort of, in my view, demonstrably beyond reckless. And I got the note back that I really look forward to the debates between Jennifer and you, and that will no doubt increase readership. So I've been amazed that they have not yet responded to you, because it would, in fact, help fuel the kind of readership that Fred advocated when he hired Jennifer. That said, I just want to ask a couple of questions and open up the floor, because there's so many people that are in this business, in this room, who could equally be speaking from up here and sharing your thoughts and reactions. But Bob, you gave us a wonderful take on the sort of terrain of how this business is done. I myself find it okay for the Washington Post to have, you know, the edge that it has. It bothers me, but it's within the sort of editorial prerogatives, you know, to see something like the Washington Post, in a way, with what you've described, has decided to be not a large-scale player, but to put itself in the behavior of a small journal, you know, with its editorials. But when you talk about the Wall Street Journal, the tradition, as I've understood the Wall Street Journal, is that the editorials, in fact, were, you know, complete, you know, somewhat predictable, that you knew where they were. You've typified them, I think, quite well. But then the op-ed page and then the other voices were quite diverse and round. I remember when Rubin was hired at the Post, Fred's response in part was also, we have David Ignatius as the other, you know, the realist voice. He didn't count all the others that you laid out. But yeah, I'm interested in editorially, you know, not to necessarily make this a conversation only about the Post, but has it been your experience that in editorial boards, those writers like Jonathan Capehart, Charles Lane, and others that are there, that you would find a unity of view when it came to foreign policy issues, or is an effort in most mainstream publications to diversify those views? And if they do, in fact, have a view, as we are suggesting the Washington Post has, are you surprised? Because one of the powerful things Jacob Heilbrunn and James Carden's piece does is it goes and does a quantitative count of other articles that appear on the op-ed page, and whether it validates that editorial view or it challenges it. And overwhelmingly, the most interesting piece of the Heilbrunn article is how the rest of the op-ed punditry on that page is used to validate, or seems to validate and correlate with the view of the editorial page.
What I would say is not that the Post is acting like a small journal, because militant or quasi-militant Wilsonianism is very much in the American tradition. I mean, that's the grand debate in American foreign policy. It goes back to Teddy Roosevelt versus Woodrow Wilson, to the debate, to other debates going forward between, it's not so much Democrats and Republicans, it's idealists versus realists, and that's very much, that debate is very much in the American tradition. So much so that Henry Kissinger, at the end of Diplomacy, which is a realist book, you know, for the most part, though it's very nuanced and full of personalities, pays homage to Wilson, you know, saying that there's no way to kill Wilsonianism. It's deeply embedded in the American character, and a realist, if he's realistic, has to deal with it. So I don't think the Post, you know, is acting like a small journal in that sense. They have a much more aggressive view than they've had in the past, and they've chosen the view of what I would call militant liberal internationalism. Remember, there's a link between liberal internationalism and neoconservatism, which is both within the American tradition. But they're both opposed to realism. I would say that the only time realism is popular among the media elite is after something has gone demonstrably and horribly wrong. When the worse things are, the more realists are respected. And when things start to go better, people cast off the realists, and you read less a realist point of view in the media. I would say one final thing, that while the Post, the Times, and the Journal have varying degrees of Wilsonianism, when you actually talk to bureaucrats in the Pentagon or the State Department or the CIA, the NSA, the people in the middle levels, the deputy assistant secretaries, the assistant secretaries, they wouldn't be comfortable characterizing themselves in either way. But their sensibility is inherently realist, because they have to deal with practical problems that come across their desk all the time. And that's why most of them are thankful when the problem they're dealing with is never in the news, because it makes it easier to deal with.
Jacob, do you have thoughts on this?
I don't have any disagreement with Bob there. I mean, I think his point about the middle level of government is actually something that this fellow wrote an article, Michael Glennon from Tufts University, wrote a piece for us about how the foreign policy in the government is largely run by that cohort, which it makes it difficult if a president comes in wanting to push things either way. His argument was that Obama was unable to really push the national security bureaucracy towards more openness, because this cohort would resist it. Things just rumble along to many degrees. Now, you could argue that he's exaggerating that, but I suspect that Paul Pillar might agree with that.
Let me bring Henry in real quickly and then go to the audience. You know, as I was listening to your different spheres and essentially the role that these different spheres have, and whether the state and media have become more disentangled, I basically see it a little bit differently when I look at things like Afghanistan, where anyone that spent time in Afghanistan would see that the war as it was being described on op-ed pages in the United States was completely different than what was happening on the ground out there. There was a very different kind of combat going on over here that had more to do with lobbying money, DOD money, you know, various ways in which communication shops were sharpening, and that was what we were reading in the papers. But those that had on-the-ground experience that were much more empirical and reporting, and that's where blogging I always sort of saw as the corrective measure, that you could bring in different views to sort of come in and challenge. But I'm interested in these bandwagoning moments, whether it's the invasion of Iraq, whether it was the fight over Afghanistan, where it's been John McCain's sort of loyalty oaths on the surge, that what has happened with media commentary is that if you choose at those moments to run against the flow, there are various prices that journalists pay. And let's just be honest, there's a structural corruption, and I think you were getting at it in sort of a long way, between some forms of journalism and access and power in this town. It's not necessarily an explicit part of this, but I know during the Iraq build-up from the New America Foundation, when we had people like Anatol Levin, myself, and others, Dimitri, people that were out there raising fundamental questions about whether that was it. There were attempts to just, you know, for a variety of reasons, create constraints or closure or shut down some of those arguments. But I'm interested in these bandwagoning moments as well, and I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on sort of large national moments and the expectations that media or editorial boards will, you know, certainly, you know, maybe the Post become enforcers in this. And Bob, you've been in this a long time. I mean, you've been one of the most intellectually honest, but these sort of the surge, Afghanistan, the Iraq War, particularly the early invasion of Iraq, all seem to me times where journalism didn't play the role it should, and that there was a co-optation and punishments with those thoughts?
I've often run against the grain, and I don't... And
yeah, you love to be thrashed, then you know you're doing your business.
And I don't know that I've suffered greatly in any way. I mean, it is harder to get into some journals than others. For instance, if you're a liberal, you're not going to submit a liberal piece to the National Review. And if you're conservative, you're not going to submit a conservative piece to the Nation. That's not censorship, that's common sense. Only in one instance, actually, you know, have I experienced what you would call, you know, censorship or blackballing. But I got over that, and, you know, and I won't go into it. But, you know, I'm working with the same editor again on another piece.
It wasn't us, hopefully.
No, no, it wasn't. But I think if you're persistent and professional, you can overcome anything. And remember, there's also a counterintuitive logic, which is the more fervent an editorial page may get on one point of view, they may decide, you know, we need the other point of view from somebody. We need more of this.
Well, that's what should happen. But
yeah, I think it does happen quite a bit.
I think Jacob's argument is that at least in the Post, in some places, it doesn't happen.
No, it's clearly not happening. I mean, that's the thing, is the dominance of that is what's so striking on both their op-ed and editorial, that it's like an echo chamber in many ways.
Henry?
I think I'm very much with Jacob on this. I think that there is certainly during the Iraq War, it was very, very hard to see people who are at the core of the U.S. political journalistic system actually making strong arguments against, and the few people who did, like Paul Krugman, found themselves having to make common cause with disreputable bloggers such as myself. And I think that there are a couple of things going on there. I think one of the forms of corruption which one did see there, which wasn't maybe so much about journalism but about foreign policy commentators more generally, was the sense that if you went against this, you would be damaging your long-term career prospects in this town. when I came to visit DC during that period, there was this very palpable sense. A lot of people who were at best unsure about the prospects of the adventure that was being promoted, but who decided that it behooved them best to shut up, go along with it, rather than find themselves isolated in the open, going against some sort of big people who might plausibly have damaging effects for their career down the line.
Interesting. Let me open the floor to others, and we'll get everyone. Richard, and then Paul. Richard Solomon.
A kind of negative comment, but your discussion reminds me of something that half a century ago when I was in grad school, the discussion about the prestige papers, so-called, and how the elite got their views. This discussion, to my mind, isn't really focused on where the elite, in the broadest sense, is getting their information. And what I see is a shift from the institutionalization of analysis to the personalization. I mean, what's happening? Where do you focus your attention if you're sort of in this swim? It's on Twitter. The leaders of the three major think tanks that I know and follow spend their time not managing their institutions, but Twittering.
Yeah.
And we can spin this out, but it seems to me that the elite is going to spend time not say, well, the Washington Post has this point of view, or the Wall Street Journal. The approach to getting opinion and information is very personalized now. Look at Morning Joe, or the Twitter, or the other social media outlets. That's the way that information and opinion is disseminated now, so that the individual policymaker or someone who wants to, as an opinion leader, get views out is probably piecing together a very disparate range of inputs from individuals and not papers.
Thank you very much, Richard. Paul?
Question for Jacob. What is known about the ideology and policy and political preferences of Jeff Bezos, and to what extent does it differ from the editorial line? And if it differs, should we expect changes in the post-editorial board?
You want me to answer that now?
Yeah, you can go ahead. I think it's fun to ask these questions as they come for a bit, but I would just want to piggyback on this, that when I read the Cuba piece that Jacob mentioned, saying that Barack Obama just betrayed Cuba and all Cubans, I praised Jeff Bezos for giving such editorial latitude to his editorial team on the Post, because it would have been there. But Jacob?
Paul, I could lie to you and tell you that I knew, but that would be wrong since you're a valued contributor to our website. So the only thing I've heard is that the print edition of the Washington Post will be shut down sooner rather than later.
Oh, really? Oh, that's tweetable. Jeff Dyer.
It's a question for any of all of you, but taking up a couple of points that Bob made. First of all, you said that realism really only gets a very fair shake after something's gone very, very badly wrong. And you said also that there had been a sort of brief moment.
He said you more regularly gets a fair take in your newspaper.
He did say that as well. But also there was this brief Scowcroft moment, you described it, in 2006, 2007, when things were going really very badly wrong. But just my question is, why wasn't there a much broader backlash against this kind of militant neo-Wilsonian, neoconservative viewpoint when things were going so badly wrong? Why was it just such a shallow backlash?
Let me take that. I think because Wilsonianism, modest, placid, militant, whatever, is deeply embedded in the American experience. Because America has had a happy experience with democracy. And not only that, America is a country that essentially inherited its systems of governance from 17th and 18th century England, though it changed it around to a presidential system. So that order was taken for granted in the American historical experience. Whereas if you go around the world, the Middle East, South Asia, other places, order is the first priority of something that has to be established. First you have to establish order, then you can go about making it less and less tyrannical as time goes along. So Americans believe they have a lot to teach the world, but in a way they have very little to teach the world because their historical experience is so much different from that of the rest of the world. And with order being taken for granted, foreign policy becomes, how do we promote our values? How do we export our values? And that's what leads to Wilsonianism being so deeply embedded in the American psyche. So even something that goes as wrong as the Iraq War did, the backlash against Wilsonianism is brief. You know, it's relatively brief and it's superficial, and we go back to a default mode.
Jeff, I'm going to give you respond on this, something a little bit less universal. Bob's got great history, but I'll be much more trite about it. I think that the time you talked about, that 2006, 2007, where you saw neocons themselves coming out and sort of offering confessions of failure, whether it was GQ or Vanity Fair, remember there was a whole page of just sort of confessional saying, here's where we got things wrong. That ended in a way because of politics, because the Democratic Party, when it was coming in and building itself, either had a Hillary Clinton or a Barack Obama. But as Obama came in, something structural happened. I'm going to mention the institution that Bob is at now, which I respect. But the two new institutions in the town that sort of evolved, that kind of captured this, were the Truman National Security Project and the Center for New American Security, which were essentially democratic bets at that time that they didn't want to be in Pentagon reform or questioning America's great projects out there, or the national greatness campaign of people like Marshall Whitman or Joe Lieberman. But that they wanted to show themselves as Pentagon huggers, if you will, and being able to embrace a large, sort of national security state and growing footprint, because they were afraid that Americans wouldn't respect and appreciate Democrats if they didn't show they could deploy power and be comfortable with that. So even though you had Obama himself come in questioning the Iraq War, the Democratic establishment came in and created a very different structural and infrastructure imprint. And that is why I think you saw the shift, because there was, and on top of that, with the exception of this institution, I know this from having worked very hard in the New America Foundation to bring in and to create a network of realist thinkers across institutions, to create a kind of trans-Northeast corridor league, if you will, of people that were thinking differently, to give them support to appear in the media, to do various things, because the liberal interventionist and neoconservative schools had massive engines and massive money supporting those people. But I have to tell you, realists got lazy and went to sleep and thought they were the orthodoxy that would never be challenged. And they just failed to support the kind of broad infrastructure that I think needed. So it was a convergence of those things around that moment. So I want to give you a much more mundane response, but I lived this in a very real way during those years. Other questions? Yes, sir. General.
That's a pretty good point you just made. Let me give you just a little slight.
Sure.
In 2006, I was asked to come and speak to the Democratic governor's semi-annual or annual, I can't remember, conference. Janet Napolitano was hosting it down in Phoenix, and the topic they wanted me to, first of all I told them no, and then they said, well, and I said, well, what do you want me to speak about? National security. Well, lots of people do that. Well, what they really wanted me to speak about is what the Democratic Party could do to repair relations with the military as an institution. It's just exactly the point that you're making. They were, even at that level, they were trying to figure out, how do we get out of this? For whatever it's worth, I said, look, I grew up in an institution that was, in which the Democratic Party had built it. I joined the military at a time when Democrats had been in power, for most of the previous 30 years. That all the generals and all the really senior people in the military at the time had all been selected by Democratic presidents. The national security strategy that the nation had, it was created by, and all the institutions of the Cold War had been built by Democrats. I didn't know anybody. I voted for the first time in 1960. I didn't know anybody that didn't vote for the Democratic. Moreover, the Democratic candidate ran to the right of the Republican on national security.
Right.
So you've got a history. The problem with you guys is that you lost your way. You forgot who you were about. You forgot all of this. you lost your way. You haven't had a coherent, party-wide, you haven't had a coherent understanding of where you wanted to go with respect to national security since the Vietnam War. That's when you came apart at the seams. So, now there are lots of stuff that's been written on this, and I know you won't read it anyway, so I'm not going to bother to tell you. So, but if you want to have any insights into the military, I'll give you 4 movies to watch, and so they all get their pencils out. But the point is, they didn't. I don't know that it was written and codified in any way, but they were looking for a way to say we too want to present ourselves as having something to do with national security.
I remember.
The point is absolutely valid.
I remember at the time on the Republicans, I was very interesting is in that precise point that Jeff Dyer just raised. I helped co-host a movie night, and the movie nights were with U.S. senators, and they would pick their favorite film. We would get people in. Dimitri, I don't know if you came to this, but the movie night movie picker was Lindsey Graham. And Lindsey Graham's favorite movie of all time, he said, was a movie called 7 Days in May. And he gave a speech about how we had to worry about military demagoguery. It was during the Bush administration. Something to remember. I mentioned it on MSNBC last night, but just something to kind of file away as a trivia point if you're ever on Jeopardy. Other questions down here? Far end. Yes, Anya.
Thank you, Anya Schmemann. I've been really struck by how out of sync the Washington Post editorial board is with its own readership and indeed with much of America. But the question is, and you touched on it, Jacob, does it really matter? I mean, and this is about the relevance of the editorial board and editorials in general. I mean, these are groupthink, anonymous pieces where, as you pointed out, most readers know where they're going to come down. And I'm not just talking about the Washington Post, but in general. And readers are increasingly looking for voices. They're much more interested in pundits, in bloggers, in op-eds, in TV personalities. Strong opinions, people that they can hitch, their own ideology to. So many papers have in fact done away with endorsements, which is really, for many readers, the only reason people do read editorials is to figure out how to vote. So with all of that, is the editorial, going the way of the dodo? Is it an anachronism? Does it have a future? Is it still relevant?
This is an easy one.
Right.
I've always thought that the problem with American editorials is that they are a little dishonest because they're not signed. I mean, in Europe, the editorials, it's not true in Britain, but there are initials. At least someone wrote it. And I think the American editorial is probably headed that way. I mean, or they'll just abolish the editorials. But the point we were trying to make in the article, and why I think Dick Solomon is wrong in his earlier remarks, is that it's too early. Dick is right that his remarks are right, but it's a little premature. The Washington Post still acts as a filter. It legitimizes certain views. It puts an imprimatur on something. It's in short, it still matters. It's going to matter less, and maybe it already does. But it still does have a certain historical weight. It
does matter. I mean, it's a pipe with yeah. Well, that gives us a new opportunity that Bob Kaplan just made. I just want to say everyone in here is an honorable pretty much, but it's so great to see Bud McFarland, who's maybe the honorable of honorables. It's good to see you here today. But Bob, thoughts on this?
As I'll just repeat, is print. Those that still maintain a print edition have a level of prestige that only electronic versions do not have. Also, print, at least in magazines and journals, quarterly journals, bi-monthly journals, they have another advantage: periodicity. In other words, the piece stays up for 2 months or 1 month or whatever the case may be. When it's only online, no matter how popular it is, it usually dies and is forgotten about 72 hours later. That's been my experience as a writer. I still try to get pieces into the print edition, no matter how small the circulation may be, because it just lasts longer. And so don't count out print yet, but we're clearly going into a totally non-print age.
You've just given me a great idea for a new blog of the contrarian to the Washington Post op-ed page that we could put online, and maybe the online version could become much bigger, that you just take every op-ed and write the opposite, and have that as the thing people read. Let me go to Dimitri Symes. Dimitri?
Well, some advertising.
Yes.
Some advertising for the national interest. We have about 2 million regional visitors a month, and our print circulation, I'm not going to mention it in a good company. But we are going to keep it precisely for the prestige reason you have mentioned. But a serious question. I think that Anya is absolutely right. If you are just talking about editorials, well, first of all, they're not that influential. Jacob is right, they're becoming less influential. And third, you're right, that if these are just editorials, everybody is entitled to their point of view. That is why I have nothing but respect for the Wall Street Journal. The problem becomes if in addition to editorials, you try to control op-ed pages in the same way. And I think it is clearly happening at the Washington Post, to some extent at the Wall Street Journal, but not to the same extent. Having said that, at the Wall Street Journal, the editorial point of view, in my view at least, does not influence the news coverage, which as far as I am concerned is fair trade. With the Financial Times, I don't always agree with the editorials, or even have sometimes question with the op-ed page politics, but the news coverage is absolutely fair trade. And that's good enough for me at least.
To keep the printed edition.
The problem starts when your news coverage somehow is either influenced or is too much in sync with your editorial line. Rick Bert was a great national security correspondent for the New York Times. And at that time, in the New York Times, there were straight news stories. There was news analysis, and Rick has done a lot of that. Then there were op-ed pieces, and then there were editorials. Now, if I look at the New York Times, so many of the news stories are somewhere in between news analysis and actually a column, because there is a very clear point of view of whoever is doing the reporting. And that I think is a problem, because you are right that these publications have a unique image of impartiality, of objectivity. And if the news coverage becomes very selective, and I would say primitive, I think that is a problem for our foreign policy making, because I don't like our decisions to be based on tweets by important people. I like to think that the media really provides some important information. Well, and that's primarily to you.
You guys underestimate what 140 spaces can do.
Yeah. Just quick things on the editorial thing. The problem with most editorials is that they're boring to read and nobody reads them because they have the style of committee speak that you know 5 people have to agree on a point before it gets in. Now the Wall Street Journal editorials, the randos, are a bit different. They're more feisty, I would say. They have more of a point of view. They're more fun to read, and therefore they're more influential, I would say. I have noticed this, that the Wall Street Journal, there's a real divide between news and editorials, a big wall, and that's why I think it's a fine publication. It's not so much that the divide is collapsing with the Post and the Times. It's that the front pages are collapsing. In other words, the front page and the headlines of like the New York Times often seem like a certain point of view of the world, and don't underestimate the importance of front page print editions, because that's what people look at in the morning. That's what gets it's what gets eyeballs.
Yeah, I agree. Rick?
Yeah, I first of all, I've enjoyed this conversation, and I want to go back.
You got a mic there.
Want to go back to.
Can you repeat what you just said?
three times. Steve, I think you've done a brilliant job chairing this meeting. I want to go back to this point about sort of the tradition of objectivity in American journalism, and because it connects really to this the last subject we've talked about, not just editorials but journalism more generally, which is I take the point that people were writing for the Associated Press. They had to kind of have it down the middle so that they could give articles to different newspapers with different perspectives. But I think also, though, we are, and this goes to maybe the digitalization, the tweeting, and so on. Is that increasingly this phenomenon that you detect in the Washington Post or the New York Times or other newspapers, where you can't really find or any kind of straight news stories anymore, is that people are bored. They don't want to read those if the alternative is kind of better written, has a point of view, has a little dash of human interest. So I think in a sense journalism is kind of evolving towards a more of a European style with a point of view, and not just a straight regurgitation of the facts, because that's kind of hard reading. If it's people don't, I think, when they're given the choice between kind of absorbing information or getting their own biases and point of view reinforced, they're gonna choose the latter. And the best example of that isn't newspaper journalism, it's the cable news revolution. Right. When cable news started, it was meant to be a kind of amplified or broadened venue for information, and CNN early on, that's what CNN was. But cable news, you don't get news very often on cable news channels any longer. You get talking heads, points of view, and that are increasingly kind of outrageous or overstated. And so, and because it's popular. Right. And that's, to me, the big danger here, Henry? Is that increasingly you're going to get people, who are really expressing increasingly reckless points of view to get market share, and with decreasing amounts of information.
Okay. Well, there's actually some interesting research on this, and the research more or less says the following. It partly supports your argument here, which is that it says that sort of cable news, you sort of effectively saw two different things happening at the same time with cable. First of all, when you have more choices, it turns out most people actually aren't interested in political news. They want sports results, they want lifestyle stuff, they do not want politics.
Or weather.
Yeah, or weather, or whatever. Secondly, those people who do want political news tend to have strong political perspectives. They tend to be strongly left or strongly right. So you get this kind of this double sort of whammy happening, where the market for objective news more or less falls out of the equation in cable. What I think is happening with the internet is maybe a little bit different. That is, you do get partisan commentary, but I think partisan commentary, it very clearly has an important role. But I think it's perhaps less important than the BuzzFeedization of media, and that is to say, if you're in a world where everything depends on how well your stories get circulated via social media, you're going to want a lowest common denominator kind of story, which is not politically opinionated, which has no opinion at all beyond some catchy headline like, you're sort of 10 people sort of took this new drug, you won't believe what happened next, sucks you in, makes you read the thing, makes you sort of whatever minimal amount of advertising, sort of a thousandth of a penny is then paid over to the website, and that's where they get their good stuff from. So the question then is there a economic model for serious news? And when you see even the New York Times suffering, you wonder whether we are going to move into a world where you see the only people really being interested in this being a relatively small, relatively elite category, Financial Times readers, Wall Street Journal readers, people who have strong economic interests in knowing what is happening, and the rest of the world not really caring, not really being interested in news except when there's something that is buzzworthy in some way, shape or form.
When you talk about elites, just for a moment, I mean, I put the Atlantic magazine in that column because we're trying to appeal to people who read. I think I disagree with this because I think I can put it out there now. It's been interesting for me. I do think the covers are important. So in our business, covers are important, but so are the articles. So is the Jim Fallows long-form piece, or the Bob Kaplan long-form piece, or the piece on sexting, whatever it may be, that draws people in. But I was shocked to learn, we were all pleasantly shocked, that our subscriptions and sales were up roughly 17% last year in hard copy, in an industry where overall the publications in our arena are down 10%. And so it's not to say that we're going to forever buck that trend, but it is to make the comment that there is real demand out there for thoughtful, I won't say nonpartisan, but somewhat balanced or objective, things that are not so ideologically pre-cooked that you've suspended your brain before you've begun the encounter with whatever intellectual piece of material you have. We're just right at the end, but let me take your comment or question.
Yeah, I would like to ask a naive question, my bad.
Yes, and can you identify yourself?
Yeah,
Go around the room, unfortunately. I figured everyone knew each other here. But
yeah, I know that I'm not in Russia, because in Russia I don't need to introduce myself, but in Washington I need to do that. Andrianik Migranian from New York Institute for Democracy and Cooperation. When I read the article and followed the discussion, I would like to follow what Rick raised or mentioned about objectivity.
Yes.
When it comes to Russia, I have an impression that Washington Post is totally out of touch what's going on in that country. It's a huge country, and every publication is, I don't know, we got an impression that some lunatics are writing these articles about Russia. Might be because the reason is that some people worked in Russia, then became editors of editorials in newspaper. That's why unit might be to ban the people who worked in Russia to write something about Russia, because they are biased and they are the victims of their stereotypes. Something is good. Of course, Washington Post is champion among American publications. Wall Street Journal is publishing. Yeah, I am finishing. Yeah, Washington Post has another problem. There are a lot of marginal people in Russian politics, many of them exiled or just left the country, so marginal that nobody knows them in Russia, but they are always on the papers of Wall Street Journal, and the same is with New York Times. I have a question. Don't anybody need in this city or in this country an objective information what's going on in Russia? This is my eternal question. I am asking again and again, and I can't get any answer to this question.
Is there a need for objective discussion about Russia, Jacob?
Well, James and I actually, it was interesting in this, James.
Short form answer.
Well, obviously, yes. And we did talk in the piece about how a whole generation, including Fred Hyatt and David Remnick and Michael McFaul and others, were shaped by what they saw as the promise of the Yeltsin era and then the failed democratization. And I couldn't help wondering, I mean, I didn't put this in the piece, but psychologically I wonder if Hyatt and others are refighting the old war over and over again. That is, that they failed in Russia, but they want to...
Russia is the victim of this war, of these guys.
Yeah, well, and that they put the same template on every country. I mean, I did a list of the countries that the Post wants to crack down on. I just started, the further you delve into this, the more you find. I think we had 25 or 30 countries, Azerbaijan, I mean, it just goes on and on. The countries that they condemn Obama or the United States for not condemning more vociferously. So yeah, I think Russia is at the back of a lot of this.
we're right at the end, and I would love to go, but I know I need to let people go by 1:30, and we're right at that point. My friendly comment would be that in coverage, whether it's on Afghanistan, or we were supposed to end at 1:30, right?
I did not know that.
Oh, can we go to 1:45?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, we got more time. Great, 15 more minutes. Thought I was giving my orders, but if we have 15 more minutes, then I would simply say, and then I'm sure Bob has a comment as well, that Afghanistan coverage really bothered me because it was an area where we had a lot of in-house expertise and had people coming in and out of Afghanistan, people that were DoD commanders, people that would come in various ways, and even what they would share with us would be remarkably different than what you would see both in much of the reporting, not all of the reporting. There were some good reporters out there, but it was just, there was that sort of gravityless, sense with some of the commentary. When the Georgia skirmish happened, and I remember talking to Dimitri at the time, I'd written a piece sort of starting with Kosovo and this. I can't tell you the number of angry calls I got from the State Department over that piece, over what I had written and put out, because it was, a kind of, a different, not to praise myself on it, but it was just a way that I sort of thought was part of the story that needed to be injected into the mix. I went on to PBS NewsHour, brought that into the mix, but it ran against the orthodoxy of what was being talked about at that time in a very kind of binary white hat, black hat discussion about Georgia, and that's why I loved your piece on the Post to some degree, because you explicated some of that for a moment. But my response to you is, in all of these areas, it doesn't matter. I don't want to have an orthodoxy myself. What you want to do is have an arena for debate, and I think the question is, sandboxes like the Washington Post seem to be less robust places for that kind of debate and discussion, so that we can have I think objectivity is negotiated ultimately, but you have to have places where you can negotiate. And that's the problem why we're having the meeting today. But Bob?
I just wanted to make a point. You're talking about Russia, but it's interesting to read the columns and editorials about Azerbaijan at the moment, because Azerbaijan is an interesting country. It's oil, natural gas rich. It's the only place in the Caucasus that can really go toe-to-toe to some degree and negotiate with Russia, because Armenia is basically a Russian satellite with thousands of troops on the ground. Georgia is compromised, weak, very weak regime, Russian troops nearby. So Azerbaijan has emerged as a kind of pivot state. If you look at the whole intermarium, between the Baltic and Black Seas, and you extend it to the greater Europe, you have countries like Poland, Romania, and Azerbaijan that are serious places that can counter Russian influence. All right. So strategically, it's nice to be friendly with Azerbaijan in the realist position. In a Wilsonian sense, they're human rights abusers. There have been just a flurry of articles about how the government is corrupt and we should be, lecturing it, not dealing with it, so to speak. But watch Azerbaijan over the next year or two. Watch media coverage about it. Watch the strategic debate over it, because it's a country far more important than it seems.
A healthy media system would have both sets of articles, right?
It may, but not on the editorial pages. The editorial pages, I've noticed of late, a kind of mini trend. They're all critical. They make the case, they mention that, this is strategic, we need it, but isn't it a shame that it does this, that, and the other? So again, here's a country where this, this dichotomy between Wilsonianism and realism is kind of playing out in an obscure way.
Henry, what's your take? You're not an American citizen, right?
I am not.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
You're not useless now.
Well, one of my friends is in the U.S. Navy as a pilot, and he used to talk about running. Bombing missions on small, worthless countries in the west of the Atlantic. So I guess that's where I came from. For me, the thing that really strikes me about American foreign policy coverage, and I guess this really reflects what a lot of people have said, is how incapable it is of capturing how people in other countries see things. So this is a much more general problem than a realist versus liberal versus whatever. There just is very, very little space in US news coverage for understanding that people actually have different perceptions about problems, about geostrategic politics in other countries. There is extraordinarily little sort of input from people from other systems. Typically when it is, it tends to be streamlined. It tends to be very much sort of fitting into the existing debates. I just get the sense as a non-American or original citizen living in this country, of a country which, because it's so big, isolates itself from the world conversation in a way that often acts to its detriment.
Interesting. Other comments, questions? Yes, right here. Tell us who you are.
Yeah, my name is Paulina. I'm just an intern at the Center for the National Interest.
Just an intern.
Thank you. But I had a question for kind of the panel about the juxtaposition that was presented between kind of the Wilsonian and realist view and the sense in which that the prioritization for order over order ideology is prioritized in those two, and then also the mention of new media forms like Twitter and BuzzFeed, and the sense in which that that kind of the more moderate view is the one that gets better circulated. You can't just pick up whatever newspaper you think will present the left or right-wing view. So my question is, do you think that in a sense the rising of these new medias might yield itself to both the kind of centralization of political views expressed and also with that perhaps more of an emphasis on realism and order over ideology?
Bob?
An overarching trend that I've seen is that we're here all discussing, the particular proclivity of the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Financial Times. But in fact, what I see among people is that little by little, all these places, maybe not the FT and the Economist, who have sort of become the in-house publications of the global elite, but certainly of the American legacy journals, is that they matter less and less. That people, when they really are influential on an issue, go to blogs, go to a lot of other a lot of specialty blogs, like The Diplomat, if you're interested in Asia coverage, or places like that. If you're interested in Central Asia, there's all these blogs. So I think that we're part of this overarching trend where the places we've been talking about, that I've been talking about, matter less and less in terms of forming people's opinion.
Jacob? I agree with everything Bob said.
The one thing I was surprised you intimated was that moderate items tend to be passed more on Twitter and BuzzFeed. My experience is that that's not, in fact, the truth, that the more salacious, interesting, provocative tend to be passed. Because I tend to tweet on kind of bland, squishy, middle, moderate things, and I don't get the but I'd say where I would push back on the Twitter BuzzFeed comments, Richard Solomon's son did an incredibly important interview with Bashar al-Assad some years ago. It was one of the longest interviews I read every word. It was about 28 pages of material. It was extraordinarily important. That got a lot of mileage in a number of waves on Twitter. In part because I had tweeted it out and continued to go back to get various items from it, and then hope that when you put the hyperlink there, that you go from the 140 spaces to something that's actually substantive, long, and fascinating, and historically important, and a real indictment to some degree of some of Assad's things. But
Steve, thank you for reaffirming family honor.
Yeah, well, but in the time, when you go out and look at it, one of the things that I think is a complication. If Strobe Talbot is out on Twitter a lot, the question is Strobe engaging in Twitter wars, or is Strobe connecting to a Smart Brookings report that people then go on to read? And I think that our pathway, I tell people when they ask, what do I read? I said, I live in a gusher, and I'm comfortable living in a gusher. I have 1,000 emails, 1,000 tweets, things that come every day, and I can't presume to see or know all of it, but I'm in it enough that the cacophony of what I'm getting, I pursue lots of it is national interest, but what is happening, and I can see it on the publishing side, those who are on the publishing side have to earn their audiences every day, and people like me who are also consumers of that are not going to be loyal to any particular publication or place or any particular institution. And so in that world, we're going to be negotiating these discussions that are very important about economic policy, national security policy, whether we go to war, whether we negotiate further with Iran. All of these issues are happening in a very different media environment. And that's why, to some degree, I completely agree with Bob that over time, that role of the editorial page anywhere is just going over the cliff because they won't be able to earn back their audience with the kind of perspectives they have. So to a certain degree, this is out there. But right now, it's a pipe. To come back to what Anya was talking about, when you look at is Anya gone? Oh, you're there. If you're a Comcast and you have, one of those smart TVs, you have 17 different choices of what you may have, but you have 17 different choices of options and players and associations, and that's still market power. So the Washington Post has market power. And I agree with Dimitri that if you ally your editorial page with a preponderance of perspectives on your op-ed page, you've changed the game for what we think is a fair and legitimate platform for negotiating reality. But anyway, I just wanted to respond to that I think that there are ways that BuzzFeed and Twitter can play a very constructive role in the kind of discussions we have to have. But unfortunately, the trends are not in that direction. So I just wanted to give you that.
Let me add one thing. It just occurred to me as Steve was talking. If you assume, just as a practical business decision, that Fred Hyatt has in fact made the right choice by putting on so many neocons, what does that say about the general debate in Washington? Because, I mean, it suggests that, in fact, these views are in many ways the dominant ones. That it's not irrational of him to, if you assume that he's not being irrational or being driven by personal ideological proclivity, then he could argue that it's reflective of a broader Washington consensus.
Steve, just a point of information.
Yeah.
I'd like to know whether in the White House, the director of communications puts together a report every morning for the president listing what's in the media, and is it the Washington Post editorial position is X or Y, or is individual blogger or reporter, as David Ignatius saying this or that. I suspect it's much more individualized than institutionalized.
It's both.
No, they take those editorials quite seriously.
They do?
Yeah, they take the editorial seriously. But what has happened, and I know it for truth, is that the other piece of this is true, not just the David Ignatius's, but the prominent bloggers, the people there. So the personalities that matter, what they may have written, what they may have said on CNN, Fox, or MSNBC, that the roster of personalities and what they've said, if they feel that they've had traction in a non-institutionalized sense, is also part of that media report. I happen to know that for a fact. So,
let me respond to what Jacob said about what it says about the debate in Washington. I would consider myself a realist, but an internationalist who believes in a strong American presence around the world. The debates I have with people are: should we have intervened in Libya? Should we have intervened in Syria? And that kind of thing. I have noticed in the recent year or two, the debate has gone in a more activist direction. Into doing more rather than less, which could be a good thing if it means standing up for a strong navy of 300 ships or something like that. I mean, that's how I interpret strong American internationalism. It could be a bad thing if it leads to us getting involved, in a place where maybe we shouldn't be, where we should not be involved in. That's where it gets very dicey. But I think we're certainly out of this Scowcroftian moment, and we're back to a kind of default, Wilsonian moment.
Can I just say, one of the interesting comments, we've been talking about new media, the values agenda or the values part of national security debates tends to fly better with new media than the realist world in foreign policy of what you don't do, or that you've got to deal with thugs. I mean, there's just not a lot of love out in Twitter for the you have to deal with thugs perspective. Can I share with them a little bit about what your
I would put it as it's irrelevant at this. No, it is because it was.
Relevant, yeah. It's kind of so Bob, during the time before 9/11,
and say no.
Yeah. He when Bob was up in Massachusetts, and Condoleezza Rice was National Security Advisor for President Bush. She was trying to educate George Bush at that time on how to be a kind of neo-realist. Didn't really work out that well, but she invited Bob down to come give a tutorial, essentially, and have a discussion with President Bush. And he had a marked up, earmarked, copied up book of Eastward to Tartary. And I don't know if many of you have read Eastward to Tartary. It's a great book, but boy, is it tough to slog through. And I was impressed that George Bush had even touched it.
This was March 2001, right before the Chinese plane issue. Right before that. 9/11 was 7 months into the future.
And who knows, you're not going to talk about what you told Bush, but what Bob told me he talked to Bush about, and Michael Lynn knows this story as well, is that he told Bush, he says, you need to talk about democracy, you need to talk about values, but you've got to deal with thugs. And I sort of feel like that is the way in which you hope op-ed pages or editors essentially walk this line between Wilsonianism and kind of Nixonian realism, if you will.
A classical realist will say you have to deal with the material at hand.
Right.
Because you can't go around the world changing the material on the ground, except here and there in relatively rare cases where the material on the ground, the leader on the ground is doing things so heinous, so against your interests, that you simply have no other choice, but to intervene. But those situations happen, but they're relatively rare. On a daily basis, you have to deal with regimes, just like we dealt with Arab dictators for decades. And what that got us was protection of the sea lines of communication, got us stability, and it got us various disengagement and peace accords with, between Arabs and Israelis, which could only have been accomplished by strongman regimes.
But you've made my point. That world doesn't translate well over Twitter. The world of victims, the world of sentiment, the world of passion, the world of people displaced, the world of refugees, all of that, which is packaged in to a certain degree, some of the values dimensions of foreign policy, migrates over Twitter and BuzzFeed far more rapidly. So to come to your political opinion about where we are in that debate, I think the political dimensions of that, of whether Washington has shifted, is I think new media has helped, if you will, the interventionist school more, because the realist school just doesn't translate well to mass audiences. To be candid.
Let me disagree with that, because I think that half is right, half is wrong. What you're doing here is you're identifying values with liberalism. And I think one of the interesting things about Twitter, I think you're right, Twitter is something that conducts towards passionate 140-character denunciations of other people's morals and whatever.
Right.
But what Twitter has done is it has helped open things up to a plurality of values rather than a sort of single one-shot kind of thing. So you see, for example, discussions of Israel and the Arab world. So you see a much wider diversity of opinion being expressed on Twitter than you do in conventional media. If you're a realist, and I'm not a realist, I would think that this is a mixed bag. On the one hand, this means that this is not being conducted the cool, sober kind of way that you might want to have if you think that cooperating with nasty people is the best that can be done. On the other hand, this also means that it's more difficult for one single coalition of values to dominate foreign policy discussion in the way that has very often happened in the past. So I would think that a realist would see this as a world where there's various strategic things that you can do, alliances that you can forge and build in order to try and get the stuff that you want to get done.
I think that's the most hopeful comment you've made all day. Just so you know. Any other comments? But yes, right here.
This is such an inside baseball discussion.
I'm
Got a microphone for you. And can you tell us who you are? We're
John-
going to do the last question.
John Gay, National Interest Magazine. I'm surprised we haven't heard yet about the decline of the Foreign Bureau. You know, how much of our coverage of the international world is shaped by the fact that there's becoming more and more of a pattern of when there's a crisis, we send in a generalist to kind of parachute in and cover things rather than having somebody who lives there, who speaks the language, who builds a deep understanding and a deep network on site and maybe brings a more nuanced understanding of whatever the country in question is.
First of all, that has been a problem historically. You send in generalists to cover wars when you need someone who's a military expert. But that's been changing. It's been evolving. The New York Times has hired former Marines, people who are real experts at this. C.J. Chivers, is an example of a really, really good military correspondent, and they've had others. Also, as the legacy papers and magazines have lost their money and they've closed their bureaus around the world, you used to have the great foreign correspondent who is very well educated, spoke a few languages, very socially adroit, but was not an expert and was sent to live in a place for 4 years. And you didn't get brilliant reporting, but you got objective reporting because he could take a step back because he had no stake in the country. Now, as budgets can't afford that anymore, because remember, that correspondent had to be paid a high salary, have a house in Rome, have his kids go to private school in Rome. You know, that's harder and harder to afford, except in a few cases. So what you've got is like a new era of super stringers, so to speak. And the super stringers tend to be highly cosmopolitan people, often from those countries, who've come to the United States, gone to a top school, and then have gone back. So you meet someone who speaks fluent Persian and Arabic, who went to Harvard, is now a super stringer in the Middle East. And so what you get is more linguistic sophistication and expertise, but often these people have a stake in the outcome to the degree that the old New York Times or Washington Post correspondent, I'm thinking of people like Henry Cam and others, Jonathan Randall and others who are very old now. They brought a certain distance and objectivity. The younger people now are more committed inside, but they have more on the ground expertise.
Other thoughts?
I think this explains a lot of what's happening in mainstream journalism. I think there's somewhat different things happening on the internet. First of all, and this goes back to something that Bob said a minute ago, you do get a bunch of specialist sites which have relatively small readership, which cater towards an elite audience. I think here people like Art Goldhammer on France, who has become, I think, essential following in the last few weeks. But on the other hand, you also have this explosion of so-called explainer journalism, which I think is going to the opposite extreme, where you have people, for example, they try to explain what's happening in France. So this is a newly popular format adopted by a number of websites. Typically, they know nothing about France beyond what they can find in a Google search, and so you get this some sort of 10 awesome things you need to know in order to understand why people are pissed off in the French suburbs. And somebody, somebody who's what Ta-Nehisi Coates called a couple of days ago internet smart, spends 40 minutes doing a quick Google search, finding 5 or 6 people who kind of sort of maybe seem to know what they're talking about, compiling the insights, anonymizing them, and then there's some sort of passes for a degree of smartness and intelligence on the internet. So I think that there are different trends going in different directions, some of them kind of problematic for understanding what is actually happening in the outside world.
Any final thoughts?
No, I mean, look, the broader point, I think Henry was talking about how the United States isolates itself. It's interesting. I mean, we'll see over the next, years. The U.S. has always been fairly solipsistic and navel-gazing, and foreign policy has never really commanded that much interest among the American public. But there is more information available to the elites today. I mean, that's clear.
Well, I want to thank General Boyd, Dimitri Simes, and Paul Saunders for hosting us here today, but particularly thank Robert Kaplan, Henry Farrell, and Jacob Heilbrunn for an excellent and wonderful and, I think, discussion with traction. So thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. And thank all of you for being here.